Welcome to the Sleeping Archive, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it.
My name is Mykola Kravets, and I have spent 37 years of my life cataloging the memories of our Soviet Republic. In the basement of the State Historical Archive of the Lviv Oblast, surrounded by endless rows of manila folders and steel filing cabinets, I have been the keeper of official truth. Every birth certificate, every factory report, every commendation letter that passes through these halls must be properly filed, indexed, and preserved according to the strict guidelines handed down from Kiev. It was Tuesday, April 29, 1986, when my world changed forever, though I wouldn't understand the magnitude of that change for several days. The morning began like any other. I arrived at the archive building at precisely 7:30, as I had every morning for nearly 4 decades. The security guard, Petro, nodded at me from behind his desk, his thick glasses reflecting the pale fluorescent light. "Morning, Mykola Sergeyevich," he said, using the formal address that had become second nature to us all. "Quiet night, no disturbances." I signed the logbook with my fountain pen, a small luxury I had allowed myself after 25 years of faithful service. The pen had been my father's, and before that, his father's. In a world where everything belonged to the state, this pen was mine, truly mine, filled with the same blue-black ink that had recorded countless official documents. The elevator was broken again, so I took the stairs down to the basement level where my office waited. The archive occupied 3 underground floors beneath the administrative building, each level reaching deeper into the earth, deeper into the past. My domain was the second sub-level, where we kept the medical and social service records dating back to 1950. My office was a small cube carved out of the larger archive space, with walls of green metal shelving that stretched from floor to ceiling. The air smelled of old paper and that particular metallic scent that comes from decades of humidity and rust. My desk, a heavy wooden affair from the 1940s, sat beneath a single fluorescent tube that cast everything in a harsh, white light. I had been working on a particularly tedious project that month, reorganizing the medical files from the rural districts. Thousands of folders containing birth records, death certificates, hospital admissions, and treatment summaries needed to be cross-referenced and properly indexed. It was meticulous work, but I found a certain peace in the routine. Each document told a story, and I was the silent witness to the lives of countless Ukrainian citizens. That morning I was sorting through files from the Pripyat Medical Center, a facility I had never heard of before, but which seemed to have an unusually high volume of documentation for such a small facility. The files were recent, mostly from the past year, and they contained routine medical reports, industrial accidents, minor surgeries, childbirth records, vaccination programs. What struck me as odd was the quality of the paper and the urgent tone of many of the documents. Most regional medical facilities used cheap, thin paper that yellowed quickly. These documents were on heavier stock, and many bore the official seal of the Ukrainian Ministry of Health. For a small-town medical center, this seemed excessive. I was deep in thought about this inconsistency when I heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy boots, moving with purpose. In the archive, we rarely had visitors, and when we did, they usually came through the main entrance upstairs. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the basement corridors with an ominous resonance. "Comrade Kravets." The voice was unfamiliar, authoritative. A man in his 30s stood in the doorway of my office, wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Behind him stood another man, also in a suit, but younger, with the alert posture of someone accustomed to following orders. "Yes?" I stood up, my hand instinctively reaching for my pen, a nervous habit I'd developed over the years. "I am Dmitry Volkov from the Regional Party Committee. This is my colleague Sergei Petrov. We need to speak with you about certain files in your possession." The older man's Ukrainian had a slight Russian accent, which immediately put me on edge. In 1986, Russian-speaking officials appearing unannounced in Ukrainian archives was never a good sign. The younger man said nothing, but his eyes swept across my office, taking inventory of every folder, every stack of papers. "Please, sit down," Volkov continued, though he made no move to sit himself. "We have a matter of national security to discuss." National security. The words hung in the air like smoke from a poorly ventilated chimney. In my 37 years of archive work, I had handled many sensitive documents: personnel files for party officials, industrial reports that contained production figures, medical records that might embarrass prominent citizens. But never had anyone used those particular words in my presence. "Comrade Kravets," Volkov began, opening his briefcase and removing a manila folder. "We have reason to believe that your archive contains certain medical documents that are no longer relevant to the state's interests. Documents that, if misunderstood by the public, could cause unnecessary panic and undermine the stability of our region." He placed the folder on my desk, and I could see that it contained a list of names, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The handwriting was precise, official, but the paper had been hastily prepared. Some names had been crossed out and rewritten. Others had question marks beside them. "These are the files we need you to locate and remove from your archive." The younger man, Petrov, spoke for the first time. His voice was crisp, efficient. "All medical records, treatment reports, and related documentation for the individuals on this list." I looked down at the list, my eyes scanning the names. Many of them were from Pripyat, some from Kiev, others from towns I had never heard of. But what struck me most was the dates beside each name. All of the medical treatments had occurred within the past week, between April 26th and April 29th. "I don't understand," I said, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. "These are very recent files. Why would they need to be removed? And what do you mean by no longer relevant?" Volkov and Petrov exchanged a glance. It was Volkov who spoke. "There was an incident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on Saturday morning. A minor technical malfunction that has been resolved. However, some medical personnel, in their enthusiasm to help, created unnecessary documentation that could be misinterpreted by foreign journalists or other hostile elements." Chernobyl. The name meant nothing to me then, but the way Volkov pronounced it, carefully, as if the syllables themselves were dangerous, suggested this was not a minor technical malfunction. "You see," Petrov continued, "some of these patients were treated for conditions that might appear to be radiation-related to an untrained eye. But our scientists have confirmed that the incident posed no threat to public health. The documentation, however, might be used to spread fear and disinformation." "So you want me to destroy the files?" I asked. "Not destroy," Volkov corrected quickly. "Relocate. Remove them from the public archive and place them in a secure location." They will be transferred to a specialized facility in Moscow, where they can be properly evaluated by experts. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost believed it myself. But something in the way Petrov's eyes never quite met mine, something in the tension in Volkov's shoulders, told me that these files would never see Moscow. They would disappear, completely and permanently. "I will need proper authorization," I said, reaching for my pen. "A written order from the regional administrator, signed and sealed." Volkov smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. "Of course," he said, reaching into his briefcase again. "Here is the authorization, signed by the regional party secretary himself. You'll notice the seal is genuine." The document was indeed official, with the proper letterhead and seal. But something about it felt wrong. The paper was too clean, too white. Official documents in our archive were usually slightly yellowed, handled by multiple bureaucrats before reaching their final destination. This one looked as if it had been prepared minutes before being handed to me. "When do you need this completed?" I asked. "Today," Petrov said. "We will wait while you gather the files. It's important that this matter be resolved quickly and quietly." I looked down at the list again, counting the names. There were 127 of them, and each name likely represented multiple documents: admission forms, treatment records, discharge summaries, billing information. It would take hours to locate all of them, assuming they were even in my archive. "Some of these files may not be here yet," I said. "Medical records from distant hospitals sometimes take weeks to reach us, and others may be in the process of being transferred between departments." "Find what you can," Volkov said. "We will return tomorrow for any files that arrive later." As I stood up to begin the search, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the list, beside several names, someone had written in pencil, "Died April 28th," or "Died April 29th." These were not patients who had been treated and released. These were people who had died within days of the incident at Chernobyl. And if their medical records were being erased, it meant their deaths were being erased too. Work, never speaking, never offering to help. They simply stood there, two shadows in dark suits, ensuring that I followed their instructions exactly. By the time I finished, I had collected 94 files. The remaining 33 names on the list had no corresponding documentation in our archive, at least not yet. As I handed the stack of folders to Volkov, I noticed that my hands were trembling slightly. Whether from exhaustion or fear, I couldn't tell. "Excellent work, Comrade Kravets," Volkov said, accepting the files. "We will return tomorrow to check for any additional documents. Until then, we trust that you will mention this matter to no one. Not your colleagues, not your family, not even your supervisor. This is a matter of state security." After they left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the empty spaces in my filing cabinets where the folders had been. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the building's heating system cycling on and off. The archive felt different now, violated somehow, as if strangers had been rummaging through my personal belongings. I tried to return to my normal work, but I couldn't concentrate. The names from the list kept running through my mind: Anatoly Sitnikov, Valentina Kozlova, Boris Stolyarchuk. Each name represented a person, a life, a story that was now being erased from official existence. That evening I walked home through the streets of Lviv, past the familiar landmarks that had anchored my life for 6 decades. The Gothic spires of the old cathedral, the cobblestones of the market square, the wrought-iron balconies of the Habsburg-era buildings. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had changed. The city felt fragile, as if it were built on a foundation of lies that could crumble at any moment. My apartment was a modest 2-room flat on the 3rd floor of a pre-war building. Anna, my wife of 32 years, was waiting for me in the kitchen, preparing our evening meal. She looked up as I entered, and I could see the concern in her eyes. "You look tired," she said, setting down her wooden spoon. "More tired than usual." Anna had always been able to read me like one of my archival documents. We had met in 1954, when she was working as a clerk in the regional education department. She understood the weight of bureaucratic responsibility, the burden of keeping secrets that were not meant to be secrets. "Difficult day," I said, sitting down at our small table. Some officials from Kiev needed access to certain files. Nothing unusual, just time-consuming. It was the first lie I had ever told my wife, and it tasted bitter in my mouth. But Volkov's warning echoed in my mind. Not even your family. I could not risk Anna's safety, could not burden her with knowledge that might endanger us both. We ate our dinner in relative silence, the evening news playing on our small television. The announcer spoke of industrial achievements, agricultural successes, and cultural events. Nothing about nuclear accidents. Nothing about hospitals overwhelmed with radiation victims. Nothing about the 94 files that had been erased from official existence that day. That night I lay awake, listening to Anna's breathing beside me. Through our thin walls I could hear the Petrov family arguing in the next apartment, their voices a constant murmur of domestic discord. Somewhere in the building someone was playing a radio very quietly, and I could just make out the melody of a Ukrainian folk song that my grandmother used to sing. I thought about the files I had surrendered, and about the 33 names that had no documentation yet. Tomorrow, Volkov and Petrov would return, and they would expect me to hand over any new files that arrived. I would comply, of course. I had no choice. But the idea of continuing to participate in this erasure of truth made my stomach turn. It was then, in the darkness of my bedroom, that I made a decision that would change the course of my life. If these people's medical records were going to disappear, if their suffering was going to be denied, then someone needed to preserve their stories. Someone needed to ensure that the truth survived, even if it had to be hidden. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Anna, and made my way to the small desk where I paid our bills and wrote letters to distant relatives. I took out a notebook, a simple composition book with lined pages, and began to write. April 29th, 1986. Today I was ordered to remove 94 medical files from the State Archive. These files contained treatment records for patients from the Pripyat Medical Center and other facilities. Many of the patients had died within days of admission. The officials who gave me this order claimed it was for national security purposes, but I believe these files are being destroyed to cover up the true extent of a nuclear accident at Chernobyl. I wrote by candlelight, the flame casting dancing shadows on the page. Each word felt dangerous, subversive, but also necessary. I was creating a record of the record's destruction, a shadow archive that would preserve what the official archive was being forced to forget. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was at my desk, pretending to work on routine filing, while actually watching the door for Volkov and Pietrov's return, when I heard a soft knock on my office door. "Come in," I called, expecting to see one of my colleagues from the upper floors. Instead, a woman entered, perhaps 40 years old, with short dark hair and the pallor of someone who had been recently ill. She wore a simple gray dress and carried a small purse clutched tightly in her hands. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am looking for Mykola Kravets. I was told he works in the archives." "I am Mykola Kravets," I said, standing up. "How can I help you?" The woman glanced around nervously, as if expecting to be overheard. "My name is Lyudmila Honchar. I am from Pripyat. I was told that my husband's medical records might be kept here." Pripyat. The name hit me like a physical blow. This woman was one of them, one of the people whose stories were being erased. Her husband's name was probably on the list that Volkov had shown me. "I'm sorry," I said carefully, "but I cannot access individual medical records without proper authorization. You would need to contact the medical facility directly." "The medical facility is gone," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Pripyat is gone. They evacuated us 3 days ago. They told us it would be temporary, that we could return in a few days, but—" She trailed off, staring at her hands. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. An evacuation. An entire city evacuated. This was not a minor technical malfunction. "Please," she continued, "I just need to know what happened to my husband. He was taken to the hospital on Saturday morning. He was working at the power plant when the accident happened. They wouldn't let me see him. They said he was being treated for burns, but then they moved him to Kiev, and then—" She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "And then?" I prompted gently. "And then they told me he was dead. But they won't give me his body. They won't give me his medical records. They won't even tell me exactly when he died. It's as if he never existed." I sat down heavily in my chair, my mind racing. This woman's husband was probably one of the names on Volkov's list. His medical records had been in the stack of 94 files I had surrendered yesterday. His death was being erased from official history. "I'm very sorry for your loss," I said, and I meant it. "But I'm afraid I cannot help you. The medical records you're looking for are not in my possession." It was technically true, but it felt like another betrayal. I watched as Lyudmila Honchar's face crumpled in defeat. She had probably spent days traveling from wherever they had relocated the Pripyat evacuees, hoping to find some trace of her husband's final days. "Thank you for your time," she said, turning to leave. "Wait." The word escaped my lips before I could stop it. "I cannot give you official records, but would you be willing to tell me about your husband? About what happened?" She turned back, confusion and hope warring in her expression. "Why?" she asked. "Because someone should remember," I said. "Someone should know his story." And so, for the next hour, Lyudmila Honchar sat in my office and told me about her husband, Victor. She told me about the night of April 25th, when he left for his shift at the power plant, kissing her goodbye and promising to bring home bread from the plant's bakery. She told me about the explosions that woke her before dawn, the strange red glow in the sky, the metallic taste in the air. She told me about the buses that came to evacuate them, about the officials who assured them it was temporary, about the belongings they left behind, thinking they would return in a few days. She told me about Victor's burns, about the doctors who wouldn't let her see him, about the phone calls that went unanswered. I wrote it all down in my notebook, every detail, every emotion, every word. When she finished, I read it back to her, and she nodded through fresh tears. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly how it was." After she left, I sat alone with my notebook, reading and rereading Victor Honchar's story. It was not an official document. It had no stamp, no seal, no bureaucratic authority. But it was true, and that made it more valuable than any government form. I was still writing when Volkov and Petrov returned. "Comrade Kravets," Volkov said, entering my office with the same authoritative stride as the day before. "We trust you have been vigilant in watching for additional files." "Yes," I said, closing my notebook and sliding it into my desk drawer. 3 new files arrived this morning. They are here on my desk." I handed them 3 folders that had indeed arrived that morning, routine medical records from rural hospitals, nothing related to Chernobyl or radiation exposure. But Volkov accepted them without question, apparently satisfied that I was complying with his orders. "Excellent," he said. "We will continue to monitor the situation. If any additional files arrive, you know what to do." After they left, I opened my desk drawer and looked at my notebook. 2 stories now. The official story of file removal and the personal story of Victor Honchar. I realized that I had begun something that I could not stop, something that was both dangerous and necessary. I was creating a counter-archive, a repository of suppressed truth. Word spreads in ways that no government can control, no matter how hard they try. Over the next 2 weeks, more survivors found their way to my office. They came quietly, one by one, often in the evening hours when the archive building was nearly empty. They came looking for medical records, for death certificates, for any official acknowledgement of what they had experienced. I could not give them what they sought. Those documents were gone, consigned to whatever fate awaited inconvenient truths in the Soviet system. But I could give them something else. I could listen, and I could remember. Sergei Volkov was a plant worker, like Victor Honchar, but he had survived. He came to my office on a Thursday evening, his hands shaking from what he claimed was cold, but which I suspected was something else entirely. His hair was falling out in patches, and his skin had an unhealthy gray pallor. "They tell us we are heroes," he said, his voice hoarse. "They give us medals and certificates, but they also tell us we cannot speak of what we saw that night. They say it is state security, but I think it is something else. I think they are ashamed." He told me about the explosion, about the firefighters who rushed toward the reactor without proper equipment, about the chunks of radioactive graphite that littered the ground like deadly confetti. He told me about the taste of metal in his mouth, about the nausea that started hours later, about the hospital in Kiev where doctors whispered among themselves and refused to meet his eyes. "They kept asking us what we saw," he said. "Over and over they asked us what we saw. And when we told them, they said we were mistaken. They said we were in shock, that we had imagined things. But I know what I saw. I know what I breathed. I know what that explosion did to us." I wrote down every word, filling page after page of my notebook. Sergei's testimony was followed by others. Oksana Petrenko, a nurse who had treated the first victims. Dmitry Kovalev, a bus driver who had evacuated residents. Maria Bondarenko, a teacher whose entire class had been relocated to schools hundreds of kilometers away. Each story added another layer to my understanding of what had really happened at Chernobyl. The official version, a minor technical malfunction with no lasting consequences, was revealed as a lie so comprehensive that it bordered on the absurd. The truth was far more horrifying. An explosion that had torn apart a nuclear reactor, spreading radioactive contamination across thousands of square kilometers, affecting hundreds of thousands of people. My notebook grew thick with testimonies, and soon I needed a second notebook, then a third. I developed a system of symbols and abbreviations to help me record the stories more quickly and efficiently. I became skilled at asking the right questions, at drawing out details that the survivors might have forgotten or suppressed. But I also became increasingly paranoid. Every footstep in the corridor made me freeze. Every unexpected visitor made my heart race. Every time Anna asked me about my work, I felt the weight of my deception pressing down on me like a physical burden. I was particularly worried about my hiding place for the notebooks. My desk drawer was too obvious, too vulnerable to search. I needed somewhere more secure, somewhere that would not be discovered even if my office was thoroughly investigated. The solution came to me during a routine inventory of the archive's card catalog system. The wooden catalog drawers were old, dating back to the 1920s, and several of them had developed gaps between their backs and the cabinet frames. These gaps were invisible from the front, but large enough to conceal thin objects. I began storing my notebooks in these hollow spaces, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. Each notebook was numbered and coded, with a master list hidden in a different drawer. If anyone found one notebook, they would not immediately understand that it was part of a larger collection. By the beginning of June, I had collected 17 notebooks filled with testimonies from Chernobyl survivors. Each notebook contained 8 to 10 detailed accounts, written in my careful handwriting, documenting experiences that had been officially declared non-existent. The work was taking its toll on me. I was losing weight, sleeping poorly, and jumping at shadows. Anna noticed, of course, but my lies to her were becoming more elaborate and more frequent. I claimed to be working on a special project for the regional committee, something that required discretion and long hours. She accepted this explanation, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The worst part was not the fear of discovery, but the moral weight of what I was doing. Each testimony I recorded was a small act of rebellion, a violation of the state's authority to control information. I was preserving evidence of government incompetence and cover-up, material that could be used to embarrass or undermine the Soviet system. Yet I could not stop. The people who came to me were desperate for someone to acknowledge their suffering, to validate their experiences. They had been told by doctors, by officials, by the state-controlled media that their symptoms were psychosomatic, that their fears were irrational, that their memories were unreliable. I was perhaps the only person in an official capacity who was willing to listen without judgment, to record their words without dismissing them as hysteria or propaganda. This responsibility felt heavier than any bureaucratic duty I had ever shouldered. One evening in mid-June, a young mother named Svetlana Marchenko came to my office. She was perhaps 25 years old, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. She carried a small suitcase and spoke as if afraid that speaking too loudly might bring disaster down upon her. "I need to tell someone," she said, sitting across from my desk. "I need someone to know what happened to my daughter." Her story was the most heartbreaking I had yet heard. She lived in a village 30 kilometers from Chernobyl, close enough to be affected by the radiation, but far enough away to be initially overlooked by the evacuation. Her 3-year-old daughter, Katya, had been playing in the garden on the morning of April 26th, breathing the contaminated air, drinking contaminated milk from their cow. Within days, Katya had developed symptoms that the local doctor dismissed as a common childhood illness. But the symptoms persisted and worsened. Nausea, fatigue, hair loss, strange rashes on her skin. When Svetlana finally managed to get Katya to a hospital in Kiev, the doctors there confirmed what she had feared: acute radiation syndrome. "They saved her life," Svetlana told me, tears streaming down her face. "The doctors in Kiev, they knew what they were dealing with. They had seen it before in the workers from the plant. They gave her treatment, kept her in isolation for weeks. But when she was finally stable enough to come home, they made me sign papers." "What kind of papers?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Papers saying that Katya had been treated for pneumonia. Papers saying that her illness was not related to radiation exposure. Papers saying that I would not discuss her treatment with anyone, not even my family." She reached into her suitcase and pulled out a manila folder. "These are her real medical records. One of the nurses smuggled them out for me. She said someone needed to know the truth." I stared at the folder in amazement. Here was exactly what Volkov and Pietrov had been trying to suppress. Documented evidence of radiation exposure, medical proof of the government's lies. Svetlana was offering me something far more dangerous than testimonies and stories. She was offering me official documentation. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because you're the only one who listens," she said simply. "Because you write it down. Because maybe someday, when this is all over, someone will need to know what really happened to people like Katya." I took the folder with trembling hands. Inside were X-rays, blood test results, treatment notes, and a detailed diagnosis that used the word radiation repeatedly. It was evidence that could not be dismissed as unreliable memory or emotional exaggeration. "I cannot keep the originals," I said. "It would be too dangerous for both of us. But I can copy them, preserve the information." I spent the next 3 hours carefully transcribing every document in Katya's medical file, reproducing the technical language, the dates, the doctor's signatures. When I finished, I had created a complete record of one child's battle with radiation poisoning, a battle that officially never happened. As I walked Svetlana to the door, she turned to me with a question that haunted me for weeks afterward. "Do you think they will ever tell the truth?" she asked. "Do you think my daughter will ever be officially recognized as a victim?" I wanted to comfort her, to offer hope, but I had learned too much about the mechanics of denial to be optimistic. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I promise you that her story will be preserved. Whatever happens, Her suffering will not be forgotten. It was a promise that would define the rest of my life. By late summer, my collection had grown to 23 notebooks, and I was running out of hiding places in the catalog drawers. The testimonies had revealed patterns that painted a picture of the disaster far more extensive than I had initially imagined. The radioactive contamination had spread much farther than the official 30-kilometer exclusion zone. People in villages 100 kilometers away were showing symptoms of radiation exposure, but their cases were being attributed to other causes or simply ignored. More troubling still, I was beginning to understand that the cover-up was not just about hiding the immediate consequences of the accident. It was about hiding the fact that the Soviet nuclear program had been cutting corners for years, prioritizing production quotas over safety protocols. The Chernobyl disaster was not an isolated incident, but the inevitable result of systemic negligence. This realization came through a series of conversations with a man named Pavel Grechko, a nuclear engineer who had worked at various facilities throughout the Soviet Union. He had not been at Chernobyl on the night of the explosion, but he had been part of the team sent to investigate the technical causes of the accident. They wanted us to blame operator error, he told me during one of our clandestine meetings. Human mistake, failure to follow procedures, individual incompetence. But the evidence pointed to fundamental design flaws in the reactor itself, flaws that existed in similar reactors throughout the country. Pavel's technical knowledge allowed him to explain the details that the other survivors could only describe in emotional terms. The explosion had been caused by a combination of reactor design problems and safety test procedures that had been inadequately planned. The plant's operators had made mistakes, but those mistakes had been made possible by a system that prioritized secrecy over transparency, production over safety. Do you know how many similar reactors are operating in the Soviet Union? He asked me during one of our conversations. 15. 15 identical reactors with the same design flaws, the same safety problems. If this information becomes public, if people understand that Chernobyl was not an isolated incident but a symptom of broader problems, the consequences could be catastrophic for the nuclear program, for the party, for the entire system. I realized that I was no longer just preserving the testimony of disaster victims. I was documenting evidence of criminal negligence on a massive scale, negligence that continued to threaten the lives of millions of people. My notebooks contained information that could potentially save lives by forcing improvements in nuclear safety, but they also contained information that could destroy careers, topple governments, and reshape the geopolitical balance of power. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. I found myself unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to concentrate on routine tasks. Anna was becoming increasingly worried about my health, and I was running out of explanations for my condition. "Maybe you should see a doctor," she suggested one evening as we sat in our kitchen, picking at a dinner that neither of us had much appetite for. "I'm fine," I said, but the lie was transparent even to me. "You're not fine, Mykola. You haven't been fine since May. You're losing weight, you're having nightmares, you jump every time someone knocks on the door. Something is wrong, and I think it has to do with your work." She was right, of course. The stress of maintaining my secret archive was affecting every aspect of my life. But I could not tell her the truth without endangering her, and I could not abandon my work without abandoning the people who trusted me with their stories. "It's just a difficult project," I said. "It will be finished soon." Another lie. I was beginning to understand that my work would never be finished, not in any conventional sense. The testimonies would continue to arrive as long as people suffered from the effects of Chernobyl, and the official cover-up would continue as long as admitting the truth remained politically inconvenient. In September, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was organizing my notebooks when I noticed that several of the survivors had mentioned the same name, Dr. Yuri Kazakov, a physician who had been treating radiation victims in Kiev. According to multiple testimonies, Dr. Kazakov had been keeping his own records of Chernobyl-related cases, records that contradicted the official medical statistics. I decided to try to contact Dr. Kazakov, despite the risks involved. Through a series of carefully worded telephone calls and indirect inquiries, I managed to arrange a meeting. We met at a small cafe in the old city, both of us nervous and suspicious, neither sure that the other could be trusted. Dr. Kazakov was a man in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much suffering. He spoke quietly, leaning across the table so that his words would not carry to neighboring tables. "I have been documenting cases for months," he told me. "Not just the plant workers and evacuees, but people from the surrounding regions who have been showing symptoms of radiation exposure. The official numbers are a fraction of the real numbers." "How many cases?" I asked. "Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, and that's just in the immediate aftermath. The long-term effects, cancers, birth defects, immune system disorders, those will take years to manifest fully." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I have been copying medical records before they disappear, documenting symptoms that are being attributed to other causes, maintaining a parallel database of the real scope of this disaster." I stared at him in amazement. Here was someone else doing exactly what I was doing, but from within the medical system itself. We were not alone in our resistance to the official narrative. "We should coordinate our efforts," I said carefully. "Share information, cross-reference cases, build a more complete picture of what really happened." Dr. Kazakov nodded slowly. "I have been hoping to find someone like you, someone in the archives, someone with access to official documentation. Together we might be able to preserve enough evidence to eventually tell the full story." That meeting was the beginning of what would become an informal network of truth-tellers, people in various official positions who were quietly documenting the reality that the government was trying to hide. We developed careful methods of communication, using coded language and intermediaries to share information without exposing ourselves to discovery. Through Dr. Kazakov, I met Olga Timoshenko, a statistician who was tracking demographic changes in the affected regions. Through Olga, I met Boris Shevchenko, a journalist who was collecting testimonies that would never be published, but which added crucial context to our understanding of the disaster's scope. Each member of our network brought different perspectives and different types of evidence. My contribution was the personal testimonies and the documentation of official suppression efforts. Dr. Kazakov provided medical evidence. Olga contributed statistical analysis. Boris offered insights into the propaganda mechanisms being used to control public perception. Together, we were creating something unprecedented, a comprehensive, unofficial record of a disaster that was being systematically erased from official history. We called ourselves, in our more dramatic moments, the Archive of Truth, though we usually just referred to our work as the Documentation Project. By the end of 1986, my secret archive contained 31 notebooks, hundreds of pages of copied medical documents, and detailed records of our network's findings. I had documented the testimonies of 247 Chernobyl survivors, creating what was probably the most comprehensive, unofficial record of the disaster's human impact. But success brought danger. The more evidence I accumulated, the greater the risk of discovery became. I was having increasingly frequent visits from various officials, not just Volkov and Petrov, but representatives from different agencies who seemed to be conducting their own investigations into information leaks. The closest call came in November. I was working late one evening, transcribing a particularly detailed testimony from a plant technician, when I heard footsteps in the corridor above. This was unusual. The archive building was normally empty after 6 o'clock, and I had developed the habit of working after hours to avoid curious colleagues. I quickly closed my notebook and slipped it into its hiding place, then pulled out a stack of routine filing to make it appear that I was working on legitimate archive business. The footsteps grew closer, descending the stairs to my level. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with the deliberate pace of people conducting a search. "Comrade Kravets?" The voice was familiar. Petrov, the younger man who had accompanied Volkov on that first day in April. But this time he was not alone. I could hear at least 3 other people with him, and one of them was speaking Russian with a Moscow accent. "Yes?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. They entered my office, Petrov, 2 men I didn't recognize, and a woman in a severe gray suit who had the unmistakable bearing of a senior party official. The woman took charge immediately. "I am Comrade Lebedyeva from the Central Committee's Department of Information Security," she announced. "We are conducting a routine audit of sensitive document handling procedures in regional archives." Routine audit. The phrase sent ice through my veins. I had heard of such audits. They were often the prelude to arrests, transfers, or worse. "Of course," I said, standing up and moving away from my desk. "How can I assist you?" "We need to examine your filing systems, your document inventory procedures, and your records of any unusual requests for information access," Lebedyeva said, her eyes already scanning my office. "This should not take long if your procedures are in order." For the next 2 hours they went through my office methodically. They examined every filing cabinet, every drawer, every stack of papers. They reviewed my official logs, my correspondence files, my inventory records. They asked detailed questions about my procedures for handling sensitive documents and my interactions with other government departments. Through it all, I maintained a facade of calm professionalism, answering their questions honestly when possible and deflecting when necessary. The notebooks were well hidden in the catalog drawers, but I could not help glancing in their direction occasionally, certain that my nervousness would give away their location. The most dangerous moment came when Lebedyeva began examining the catalog system itself, running her fingers along the wooden drawers and asking about the archive's indexing procedures. She pulled several drawers open, checking their contents against the catalog cards, and I held my breath each time she approached one of my hiding places. "This system is quite old," she observed, tapping one of the wooden cabinets. "Some of these drawers seem to have gaps behind them. That could be a security risk. Documents could slip back and become lost." "Yes," I agreed, my mouth dry with fear. "We have been requesting funding for new catalog cabinets, but the budget allocations have been limited." She nodded and moved on, apparently satisfied with my explanation. After another hour of searching, the audit team finally concluded their examination. "Your procedures appear to be adequate," Lebedeva announced. "However, we will be implementing new protocols for sensitive document handling. You will receive detailed instructions within the next week." After they left, I sat alone in my office, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I had come within inches of discovery, within moments of losing everything I had worked to preserve. The hiding places that had seemed so clever and secure suddenly felt pathetically inadequate. That night I made a decision that I had been avoiding for months. I needed to move the notebooks out of the archive building entirely, to a location where they would be safe even if my office was thoroughly searched again. The solution came to me through Anna, though she never knew it. She had been volunteering at our neighborhood church, helping to organize the basement storage areas where they kept old records and donated items. During one of her casual mentions of this work, she mentioned that the church basement had several rooms that were rarely visited, including an old storage area behind the furnace room. I approached Father Mykola carefully, using the pretext of donating some old books and papers to the church's historical collection. Father Mykola was an elderly priest who had survived the Stalin years by learning when to speak and when to remain silent. He was also, I suspected, a man who understood the value of preserving truth, even when it was dangerous to do so. "Father," I said during one of our conversations, "I have some historical documents that might be of interest to the church's archives. Personal testimonies from parishioners, accounts of their experiences during difficult times." Father Mykola studied my face carefully. He was a man who had heard many confessions, who had learned to read the weight of secrets in people's eyes. "What kind of testimonies?" he asked quietly. "Accounts of suffering," I said. "Stories that might not be officially welcomed, but which deserve to be preserved." He nodded slowly. "Bring them on Wednesday evening, after the evening service. I will show you where such documents might be safely stored." And so I began the delicate process of moving my archive from the government building to the church basement. I could only transport a few notebooks at a time, hiding them in my briefcase among routine papers and personal items. Each transfer was an exercise in controlled terror, but gradually I moved all 31 notebooks to their new hiding place. The church basement was perfect for my purposes. The storage room behind the furnace was warm and dry, rarely visited except for seasonal maintenance. Father Mykola helped me construct a false wall behind a stack of old hymnals, creating a hidden compartment that could hold dozens of notebooks while remaining invisible to casual inspection. "Why are you doing this?" Father Mykola asked me one evening, as we worked together to conceal the latest batch of notebooks. "Because someone has to," I said. "Because these people trusted me with their stories, and I cannot let those stories disappear." "It is dangerous work," he observed. "Yes," I admitted. "But what is the alternative? To let truth die? To pretend that suffering doesn't exist simply because acknowledging it is inconvenient?" Father Mykola was quiet for a long moment. "In my experience," he finally said, "truth has a way of surviving even when powerful people try to bury it. Sometimes it takes generations, but truth endures." "I hope you're right," I said. "I have been hiding truth for 40 years, he replied. hidden in sermons, hidden in prayers, hidden in the spaces between official words. You are not alone in this work, Mykola Sergeyevich. There are more of us than the powerful realize. As 1987 began, I settled into a routine that would define the remaining years of my career. Officially, I continued my work as a state archivist, processing routine documents and maintaining the facade of bureaucratic normalcy. Unofficially, I continued to collect testimonies from Chernobyl survivors, though the flow of new visitors had slowed as the disaster faded from immediate public consciousness. The Soviet system had proven remarkably effective at managing the narrative surrounding Chernobyl. Official casualty numbers remained artificially low. Cleanup efforts were portrayed as heroic achievements, and the affected regions were gradually declared safe for resettlement. The international attention that had initially focused on the disaster was diverted to other crises, other stories. But the human cost continued to mount. Through my network of contacts, I learned of cancer clusters in contaminated areas, birth defects that were attributed to other causes, and environmental damage that would persist for decades. The official silence grew deeper, even as the real consequences grew more severe. My archive, now numbering 37 notebooks, had become more than a collection of testimonies. It was a time capsule, a preservation of truth that I hoped would someday serve as evidence for historians, for prosecutors, for anyone who might eventually hold the responsible parties accountable for their actions. Dr. Kazakov and I developed an elaborate system for cross-referencing our documentation. He would provide me with coded summaries of his medical observations, and I would correlate them with the personal testimonies in my notebooks. Gradually, we built a comprehensive picture of the disaster's true scope and its systematic concealment. We are creating evidence for a trial that may never happen, Dr. Kazakov said to me during one of our meetings. But if that trial ever does occur, the evidence will be there. The weight of this responsibility was enormous. I was not just preserving individual stories, I was preserving the possibility of justice. Every notebook I hid, every testimony I recorded, every document I copied was a small act of faith that someday the truth would matter more than political convenience. By the time I retired in 1991, my archive contained 42 notebooks documenting the testimonies of 387 Chernobyl survivors and their families. The collapse of the Soviet Union that year brought new possibilities for disclosure, but also new dangers. The chaos of political transition made it unclear who could be trusted with sensitive information, and many of the officials responsible for the cover-up remained in positions of power. I decided to wait, to continue preserving the archive while watching for the right moment to reveal its contents. That moment would not come in my lifetime, but I could ensure that the archive would survive beyond my death. Working with Father Mikhailo, I created detailed instructions for accessing the hidden repository, along with explanations of the coding systems I had used and contact information for other members of our network. These instructions were sealed in a separate container, to be opened only when circumstances made disclosure safe and appropriate. I also wrote a comprehensive statement explaining my motivations and methods, a document that would serve as both confession and justification for my years of secret documentation work. I, Mykola Kravets, archivist of the Lviv Oblast State Archive, have spent 5 years collecting and preserving testimonies from survivors of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. This work was undertaken without official authorization and in direct violation of orders to suppress information related to the disaster. I have done this work because I believe that truth has an inherent value that transcends political convenience, and because the people who suffered from this disaster deserve to have their experiences acknowledged and remembered. The testimonies contained in this archive represent the voices of hundreds of individuals whose stories were deliberately erased from official records. They include plant workers, evacuees, medical personnel, cleanup crews, and residents of contaminated areas. Together, these testimonies provide evidence of the disaster's true scope, the government's systematic efforts to conceal that scope, and the long-term consequences that continue to affect thousands of people. I have hidden this archive not out of cowardice, but out of necessity. The political climate during the years following Chernobyl made disclosure impossible without endangering both the archive itself and the people who contributed to it. I hope that future generations will find the courage and the opportunity to use this documentation in service of truth and justice. To whoever discovers this archive, use it wisely. The people whose stories are contained here trusted me with their pain, their fear, and their hope. Do not betray that trust. Ensure that their voices are finally heard. As I seal this final document with the others, I felt a profound sense of completion. I had done what I could with the tools available to me. I had preserved truth in the face of systematic lies, maintained memory in the face of official amnesia, and protected the dignity of suffering people in the face of bureaucratic indifference. I was 65 years old, a retired civil servant with a modest pension and a secret that would die with me unless someone else chose to carry it forward. As I walked home through the streets of Lviv that evening, past the familiar landmarks that had anchored my life for so many decades, I felt the weight of my notebooks hidden beneath the church, waiting patiently for their moment of revelation. The truth I had preserved was not comfortable truth. It was not the kind of truth that would make anyone feel better about the world or about human nature. But it was truth nonetheless. And in a world where truth had become a casualty of political expediency, that preservation felt like a victory. Anna was waiting for me when I arrived home, as she had waited every evening for 36 years. She smiled as I entered, and for the first time in 5 years I felt that I could return her smile without the shadow of deception. "Good day at work?" she asked, as she had asked thousands of times before. "Yes," I said, and this time it was not a lie. "A very good day." Outside our window, the city of Lviv settled into evening, its ancient stones holding their own secrets, their own memories of truth preserved against the forces that would erase it. In a basement across the city, 42 notebooks waited in darkness, guarding the voices of people who had been officially forgotten, but who would not, could not, be truly silenced. The archive would endure, the truth would survive, and someday, when the moment was right, the silence would be broken.
You've been listening to The Sleeping Archive. Sleep well. History will wait.